I'm Angela Kelly Robeck, host of the Empowered Principal Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Larry Freeland. Larry is a Vietnam veteran, and his grandfather was a doughboy in World War I. His father was an officer in the Army Air Corps in World War II and the U.S. Air Force beyond, and his two brothers are also war veterans, having served in other conflicts that followed after the Vietnam War. Larry is the author of the award-winning novels Chariots of the Sky, a story about U.S. assault helicopter pilots at war in Vietnam, and Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch. Awesome conversation, excellent books, and you're going to learn so much. Thanks so much for listening. It would be so cool if you went to my website, stephenmiletto.com/reviews, and left a review. Could you do that for me? Say some nice words, maybe 5 stars? Thanks so much. You are awesome. Enjoy the show.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Miletto. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. With Dr. Steve Miletto.
Larry Freeland, a Vietnam veteran, is an author of war-themed historical fiction books. He comes from a long line of military veterans. His father was an officer in the Army Air Corps, United States Air Force, whose career spanned 30 years and included World War II through the early stages of the Vietnam War. His grandfather was a doughboy in World War I, and his two brothers were both war veterans, having served in multiple conflicts that our country has been involved in following the Vietnam War. Born in Canton, Ohio, he also lived in Biloxi, Mississippi, Syracuse, New York, Riverside, Colorado, parts of Florida, and Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico. He graduated from the University of South Florida in Tampa in 1968, and then he entered the U.S. Army at the height of the Vietnam War, serving one tour in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division as an infantry officer and a CH-47 helicopter pilot. Upon release from active duty in 1973, Larry returned to civilian life and pursued a career in the financial industry. He earned an MSA in management from University of Central Georgia. After retiring from banking in 2001, he worked as an independent financial consultant for 3 years in the Atlanta area. He then worked as an instructor for 6 years with Lanier Technical College in their management and leadership development program. Freeland's books Chariots in the Sky and Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch, are Amazon bestsellers, have earned critical acclaim, and have received hundreds of favorable reader reviews. Now retired, he lives in North Georgia with his wife Linda, a retired school teacher. They enjoy traveling around the country, going on cruises, and visiting historical places in Europe. They are fans of Le Mans racing and drive their Corvette to several annual races held in the United States. They are involved in supportive activities associated with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and veterans-related organizations. For more information, see LarryFreeland.com, and I'll put that information in the show notes. A little bit about two of the books. About Chariots of the Sky, a story about U.S. assault helicopter pilots at war in Vietnam. It is the final major operation of the Vietnam War, 60 days for 750 helicopters to do battle. Who wants to be the last man killed in Vietnam? And about Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch, a tale of courage, sacrifice, love, and honor. This 20th century historical fiction saga addresses the horrors of World War I and the challenges that military men faced upon returning, including mental trauma and physical illness, in addition to the hardships of the Great Depression, as well as other historical events before World War II, including the Bonus Army March of 1932 and the Little Steel Strikes of 1937. Larry, welcome home, and thank you for your service to our country, and thanks for joining me today. Say hi to everyone.
Hello, and thank you, Steve, for having me on. I'm looking forward to chatting with you for a little while.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and we've got what I'd like to do is start off by talking about you and writing. Could we talk about what made you want to write novels? I mean, were you always a writer?
No, I wasn't. If somebody would have said, Larry, you're going to be writing books 5 years ago, and I just said, no, I don't think that's in my future. I kind of backed into it. My wife, Linda, is an avid reader, read books all the time. She's got one or two on her nightstand. I'm a movie guy. I kind of grew up on movies, love movies. I read books, but not like her. And many years ago, I digress a second. I saw a movie called Oliver Stone's Platoon back in the late 80s. And I knew at the time, being a movie guy, that he was going to make a couple more movies. So after that movie, I thought, gee, I think he ought to make a movie about helicopter pilots. That was iconic to the war. Wrote him a letter, and he got back a little later on and said, well, I've got both the next movies kind of written up and ready to go. I'm producing one now, the second one, which ended up being Born on the 4th of July. And he said, they don't involve helicopters, but you got a great idea. I encourage you to write a book or write a screenplay and see what happens. So I think it was like 1990, 91. I sat down, did some research, and I wrote a screenplay called The Flying Pachyderms, loosely based on my experience in Vietnam, just over that short operation, a 90-day period. Entered it in a contest in Atlanta, a screenwriters contest, Southeast Screenwriters, and got honorable mention. Wow, this is great. Nothing happened, and everybody that read it, though, and there would be a lot of people, and I kept copies around the house for years after that, said, this ought to be a book. You could really get into your characters and so on and so forth. And I said, well, I'm just not a writer. I was at that time fully engaged in my banking career, and I just couldn't envision myself sitting down and writing a book. But anyway, I put it all away, and about 2017, 2018, it all came back. And I said, that story I had in mind, I really think I ought to sit down and try writing. So going into the end of 2019, and we come into 2020 with COVID on the horizon, I said, I'm just going to go up in my office and shut the door and write a book. So during COVID, I spent 7 months up here in my office writing this book, Chariots in the Sky. And it was a wonderful experience for me, and I enjoyed it. And I ended up getting a publisher here in Atlanta, and he's out in California too, Frank Eastland with Publish Authority, sending my manuscript because he was taking on unsolicited manuscripts if you liked them, however they make those decisions. And he said, you got a good book here. So it needs a little polishing and everything, but we'll take you on. So we signed a contract, and we polished up the book, and we put it out there. And Chariots has done quite well, and I've been very pleased with it. And I was told, if you start writing a little bit, you probably ought to have another idea or two, because if you got a good book and it's doing well, your publisher, if you've got one, is going to say, hey, let's do another one, and which he did. And nice. So I said, well, I got this idea about maybe writing a long story about one family's generation of 3 generations of men, spanning about 100 years of our history. And he said, well, write up a little summary memo, if you will, a high-level memo, and let's see what you got. I did that. He said, oh, I like this. He said, write your first manuscript, and we'll go for it. So we signed a three-book contract and titled it Legacy of Honor, a trilogy. And each book has its own subtitle. Book 1, which we'll be talking about, is Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch. we just sent out book 2, subtitled The Air Warrior, for advanced reader reviews. So we hope to get some good reviews back and plan on publishing that probably the end of August going into September, depending on how well the reviews go. And then book 3, I'm loosely working on that now. It's subtitled The Descendants. And basically the storyline is, the first one, the Patriarch's World War I. He has a son who serves in World War II, Korea. And he has 3 sons that will go on to serve in Vietnam and all our conflicts post-Vietnam. So that's a long answer to a question, but I fell into it. I really enjoy it. I kind of get lost in writing the characters and the stories and everything. So it's been a real fun experience. And we'll see where it goes from after I finish the trilogy.
Nice. That's awesome.
I do have a couple other ideas, but he hasn't broached that yet. I want to, writing a book takes a good while. Yes. Anyone who's done that. And, but anyway, that's kind of that. That's
excellent. I appreciate you sharing that. And so it brings me right into, because you already got me thinking about another question I want to ask. Because let's talk about this first. Your books are historical fiction. Could you talk about how you research? I mean, what do you do here? What do you spend time doing to try and figure out the information that you need to make the reality happen?
Well, I'm also a history buff, American history. I'm not a war guy. I don't relish war, but our whole history, when you go back 300 years, 250 years, it always seems to be a conflict or a war, which every generation has one or more of them. And I grew up around veterans on military bases, and I've been associated with them basically my whole life. So I just thought that's a genre, military history, which fascinates me anyway. I've read a lot of books about that aspect of those kind of books, those kind of genres. So how do I go about researching it? Well, one, I've known a lot of veterans. I've known a lot. Going back to World War I, we'll talk later about it. My grandfather was a veteran of World War I. I met some of his buddies when I was a young boy. And then World War II, those are my personal heroes. And I've been around them, basically my whole life. Grew up on Air Force bases. They're called SAC bases, Strategic Air Command. My dad being a career Air Force officer. So, I was around pilots the whole time. It's kind of interesting. I became a helicopter pilot, but we'll get into that a little later. So how do I research it? Well, I grew up a lot of people who experienced it, particularly World War II, Korea, and my own experiences in Vietnam and post-Vietnam. I read not a lot of books, but read historical books about the wars. And I do a lot of research online. The websites that are out there from World War II organizations and just various historical societies and so on. You can gather a lot of information from that. And when I wrote, I can use, just digress real quick, in writing the first book here for the legacy, the Patriarch, about the first half of that book deals with the war in France and the trenches. And I went out on Google Maps and would literally pull up the battlefields and then drill down and do the topography to get a feel for the land. Although I've never been on those battlefields, I could get a little bit of a flavor for what the hills look like and so on, and then look at all the different pictures from that period of time. So I do a lot of research online. So the combination of those things would help pull together the storyline. And I chose historical fiction, but I wanted to make the history real as possible and, as accurate as possible, but put my characters that are fictional in the middle of it and let them kind of traverse or go through that period of our history. And I just enjoy doing that, living kind of through the characters. So that's a little bit how I got around to that.
That's awesome. That's cool. What lessons do you think a writer of historical fiction could share with his audience? I mean, as you're doing this work, there's got to be, possibly some messages or some things that you could make sure that are part of your story. What do you think?
Well, I think if you're going to do historical writing, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, you need to do your homework, your research. You really want to, to the best of your ability, understand the timelines, what happened, if you will, some of the major characters and events. And then when you're writing it, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, I'm just going to speak to the fiction because that's what I enjoy. Try and be as true as you can to that and take your reader through that period of time where they're walking in the protagonist's steps. They're living his or her experiences. So you're not only going through history, but you're kind of living it. And you come out the other side and you go, holy cow, I've learned a little bit about history, but I did it through my characters. Like, for instance, in Chariots, the main character, protagonist is a captain, TJ, St. James. Many people who have read that, and I've got over 500 actual comments out there on Amazon right now, and multitudes other I hear, but a lot of people come back and say, geez, I thought I was TJ. I was right there in the helicopter with them, and said, I had no idea what you pilots went through and crews when you were down there in those hot LZs. Or in World War I, for that when the first half of the book is basically in the trenches and my main character is going through that, which kind of sets up the second half when he comes back and he's got to assimilate back into our country and all the things that he and his fellow veterans had to deal with doing that. You have a better appreciation for what they did in the trenches. And I've had many people, particularly ladies that have read the book, say, I was sure glad to get out of the trenches. It was really rough in there. So I try to put my readers right in the action so they can have a little better appreciation for it and travel through history. So you come out the other side and you learn a lot of little things about that period of time. And I try to capture that. So.
That's awesome. That's it's I can only imagine as you're writing and trying to bring the reader into the story just to make that happen. So good stuff. I got one more writing style question for you before we get into your books. Do you outline or do you start with an idea and let it take it where it goes?
Probably a little bit of both. I do a high level, so I got a storyline. I mean, when I go back, I wrote that screenplay, and screenplay writing is a little different from book writing, but they always say you got to have a storyline, which is one sentence. This is a story about, and then kind of an overview, and then I drill down a little bit as an overall outline on a timeline. So if it's historical and you're going through a period of time, the blah, 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 the different dates, not that they're critical, but so you at least have a historical timeline there. And then the events that I want to capture in those sections. So there's a high level outline. And then I design my characters, my main character and some of the key supporting characters, design them or build them, if you will, kind of like an avatar. and then I'm writing the story, at least my first 3 books, the one that'll come out here shortly, The Air Warrior. I've done those in first person present. So I'm kind of the main character going through this. And when I kind of get comfortable with him, I just turn him loose. I mean, I had ideas, but if I'm in there a while, if he says, let's go this way and just starts drifting off, I'll just follow him. I can always come back and change it. But when I get into character and I'm creating, I just let him run. And then I can clean it up later. But that's kind of the fun of it to me. So
that's cool.
Yeah, so it's high level and down low.
That's awesome. One of the things you've talked about, we've kind of touched base a little bit about, is your family. I mean, you're a third generation military veteran. Could we go a little bit more detail into, and I'm fascinated by this. I'm a former history teacher and I've always loved history. And although I didn't want to tell my dad that much, but I've turned into my dad because he used to stop and read all the road signs and he was huge into different types of military history. But tell me a little bit more about your family. Tell us. Let's go back at the beginning.
Well, it's 3 generations, and this trilogy is loosely based on my family. My grandfather, who I dedicate the first book to, the Patriarch, he was a big man. He was about 6'3", built like a lumberjack. Before the war, he worked in a steel mill. Then he got drafted, and then he went to France and fought over there in the trenches with the Americal Division. He was in all 3 major battles they had during the American involvement from mid-1917 through the armistice of November 11th, 1918. He came back, and then he went back to work for the steel mill, and he just had a real good career working with the steel mills there in Canton and Louisville, Ohio. So he had his 2 years, I guess it was, give or take, in the service. Never talked about it. He did share 2 stories with me. He and I will come back to that, but he and I were really close. I spent a lot of time around him as a younger man, or boy, and then in my early college years. But he would always tell these 2 stories, which I've embedded in the book. But he never talked about anything else associated with the war. And then my father, he was in Ohio State in his senior year, and he was in a cadet military program. They didn't call it ROTC back then. I forget what it was called, but he envisioned being a pilot someday. And he was a senior in Ohio State in electrical engineering. And of course, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we went to war. And in his senior year, but they needed to accelerate across the board, bringing in men in all the branches and whatever they could do. They accelerated his program, and he graduated early, like in March of 1942, and he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps, and he began his career. Went through extensive training, ended up in England later towards the end of 42, and served with the 8th Air Force there. War ends, he comes home, he marries my mother in Canton there, and gets out for a couple years and tries civilian life. And it just didn't feel right for him, and he missed some of what he found appealing in the military. the comradeship of the men he served with, and the sense of purpose, and all those things that kind of make military life what it is. So he went back in just before the Korean War, and he ended up making it a career. He stayed in 30 years. He served in Japan and Okinawa during the Korean War, and came back, and then he ended up in SAC, Strategic Air Command bases, until he retired in 1971. He was a senior officer. Met many of the top people in the service. I met some of them too. He and General Curtis LeMay, who was, of course, a key figure in World War II, both in Europe and in Pacific theater, ended up being also the top guy for the Air Force, Chief of Staff for the Air Force. And Dad had met him when he was in England with the 8th Air Force there. And anyway, they kind of touched each other's careers, if you will. Not that Dad influenced LeMay's, but LeMay kind of influenced my dad's, because Dad was also a minor in Russian history. He was just enamored with Russian history. And a lot of the top generals in World War II, everybody picks on Patton, but LeMay and a lot of them, Eisenhower, although he didn't really talk about it, thought the Russians were going to be a major adversary after the war. And LeMay was real interested in that. So that's how he and Dad kind of hooked up, and they had touch points over my dad's military career, where they would talk a little bit about that. Of course, SAC main purpose was a nuclear deterrent against the bad guys, more specifically the Russians at that point in time. So that was Dad's career, and I grew up in that environment, met a lot of pilots from World War II, Korea, of course, the bomber bases. And, as a young boy growing up on those bases, they had what they called alerts for the B-47s, and then they went into the B-52s. And there'd be many a time we'd be at the theater on a weekend or at night, and when those fire up those jets out there, they do these alerts. You hear them firing up, and the whole base seemed to shake. I mean, we're talking a lot of aircraft there. And you never knew if they were launching to go to war or if it was just practice. If they launched, you could tell when they took off. If they weren't going to launch, they'd shut down eventually and get quiet. But if they launched, 2, 3, 4, 5 when we would go off. And you never really knew if that was for real, because they did serious drills back then. And, you just kind of go, oh my gosh, this is hope they come back soon. We don't want to go to war. So kind of grew up around that. And then I ended up going in the Army for 5 years and did a tour in Vietnam, got out and started a banking career. And my middle brother, Tom, he went into the Navy, and he was a pilot for 27 and a half years. He retired as a captain in the Navy. He was in the first Gulf War, and he was in a lot of little things, which I'm going to cover in my third book, loosely on his character. And my younger brother, Bob, he served 2 years in the Army. He was in Korea while I was in Nam. He came down he got drafted I go cover that later, but he got drafted while I was in Vietnam, middle of my tour, and they came down on orders. And my mom told me about it in a letter. And so I called the Pentagon and said, hey, I'm here. If you want me to stay, then you send my brother somewhere else, because you're not going to have me and my brother over here at the same time. And I said, I'm a pilot, and he's just a grunt. So, you make up your mind. I'll be glad to go home. So they cut new orders and sent him to Korea, and he did a 1-year tour on the DMZ there in Korea. Came back, got out, ended up being going to work for the federal government as an agent. Did all kinds of stuff until he retired at 50. And then 9/11 happened, and he ended up doing 2 18-month tours in Iraq and one in Afghanistan for 13 months as a special contractor for security force. He was he spent a lot of time in Africa when he was working for the government as an agent, and he was a weapons expert and an explosive expert. So he did a lot of that over there. So, my grandfather, my father, myself, and my brothers, so we all served in some capacity. We all saw a little action at some point. And so it's just been a part of me, so to speak.
That is amazing. That is awesome. And I can't thank you enough for what your family has done for our country, and appreciate it to put themselves in harm's way like that. So, but thank you so much. We got, one of the things that I'd like to do is let's switch to you as a combat helicopter pilot. I mean, could you talk about how you became how did it go from infantry to the helicopter pilot, and could you just kind of share a few of your experiences?
Sure. It's hard for younger people today to understand, but back in those days, up through the Vietnam War, they did away with the draft in 1972, but the war was we were pretty much out of it by the time they stopped the draft. But up until that point, young men had to all register when they turned 18 and were subject to the draft. And a lot of, prior to the Vietnam War and so on, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the draft was there. And that's how the military, particularly the Army, brought in a lot of the men they needed to fill their ranks, so to speak. When I was in college from 64 to 68, the war started to really build. And, 64, everybody got, where's Vietnam kind of thing. I had a friend that graduated a year before I did in high school down at Ramey. Graduated 63. I graduated in June of 64. And we were told about a month before we graduated that he had been killed in Vietnam. He was an infantry guy in the Army. Everybody goes, warriors, Vietnam. We really hadn't heard about it at that point. By 65, you had the Hai Drang Valley. We were soldiers once, so everybody was hearing about Vietnam. And we lived with that through my 4 years of college. All students had to follow up for a deferment called 2S, which I did every semester to stay up so the draft wouldn't come after me. And then I finally decided, well, I think I want to fly planes. So I applied to the Air Force program to go through pilot training. I did that in 67, got accepted in early 68, January or February. And the earliest I could start me was in October. I was graduating in June. My class for officer school would have been in October. And then if I completed that, I got commissioned, I'd go on to flight school. Well, when I graduated in June, my draft board drafted me in July and wouldn't give me a deferment. So I ended up going in the Army and I went through basic training, advanced infantry training. And I was coming down at the end of my AIT, and I really wasn't planning on making it a career by any stretch. And a lot of the guys in my advanced infantry training unit were also college graduates, and the Army was trying to get us to volunteer to go officer school and become officers. They had 3 branches: infantry, artillery, and armor. And I had a dual degree in mathematics and finance. I wanted to go to work for Big Blue IBM at that time. But anyway, I thought, well, I'll volunteer because they'll probably pick me to go to artillery because of mathematics, right. Angles, numbers. That didn't happen. Every one of us got selected for infantry school. So we all went down to Fort Benning and trained 6 months to become infantry officers. And I graduated in 1969, July of 69. And we were all given 6 months in country. And then we were going over to Nam as platoon leaders. And while I was at Benning, I was an instructor on heavy weapons. And I met a lot of helicopter pilots in our field exercises. And they said, well, why don't you look at helicopter school? You talked about wanting to fly. You're flying. You're in the infantry. It's pretty rough over there as an infantry guy. Of course, pilots, it's pretty rough too. And they said, but at least every once in a while you're going to be back in a base camp. You might get a cold shower, a hot meal, sleep on the cot. So anyway, I volunteered, got accepted, went to flight school, and graduated from flight school. I went January until late November into December of 1960 or 1970. Got my wings, transitioned to Chinooks, which are the big helicopters. They still fly. Was sent to Vietnam in 1971, January 3rd and 71, and did a tour over there with the 101st. So that's how I kind of fell into aviation in the Army. I really enjoyed flying helicopters until I got to Vietnam. And there was days it was fun, and there were other days it wasn't. But when I got there, there were several aviators in the airplane we flew over from the States. We landed in I'll just talk a few minutes about Vietnam. We landed in Tan Son Nhut, in south part of Vietnam there in Saigon. And I thought at that time it was 1971 and the war was winding down. Nixon was cutting back on the troops significantly. And the lower part of South Vietnam was pretty inactive. I mean, there's still a little bit going on, but what was actually occurring mostly was up near the demilitarized zone, the separation between North and South Vietnam. And I thought I'd be, and as the rest of the guys that were aviators in our group, I thought we was going to be in Saigon, what they call 4 Corps down there, because they flew us in down there. There was another place they could have flown us in up closer to the DMZ. Well, anyway, we came down on orders after being in Saigon for 2 days to report to the 101st Airborne, which was up in I Corps on the demilitarized zone. They were on Phu-Bai, Hue, Quezon, Quang Tri area. And we didn't know at the time, but they were filling up their ranks as best they could because they were getting ready to kick off this big Wamsan 719 in end of January, which was going to be a 4-month operation that the South Vietnamese were going to go into Laos and try and cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we ended up there, and I was assigned to the A Company, 159th Chinook Company out of Phu-Bai. I got there about mid-January because we had to do a week of 101st Welcome to the Country training out in the boondocks. And being an infantry guy, they put me out in the field to get the flavor for it. And, I haven't been in the cockpit of a helicopter in over 45 days, guys. Don't you think you ought to put me there before I start flying? Right. Well, eventually I got up in my unit, and I spent 2 weeks getting to know the area and getting reacquainted with the Chinook. And they kicked off this invasion, well, they call it incursion into Laos on February 1st of 1971. And I was in that from the beginning to the end. And unfortunately, for me, it was, and a lot of the fellows, that was the biggest and most extensive operation of the war for helicopter pilots. And it was supposed to last 4 months. And we, being the Americans, were going to provide all the air support because the Vietnamese they hadn't really gotten trained on helicopters yet. They had a few, but they weren't ready for that. And Nixon prohibited by Congress to send any Americans outside of South Vietnam to fight. But we could fly. The Air Force could fly, the Navy could fly, and the Army could fly. So the operation was designed to see if the Vietnamese could really handle themselves. And they sent 22,000 South Vietnamese military guys, mostly Army submarines, into Laos, trying to cut through the country to stop the flow of supplies from coming through Laos. But we had to provide all the air support. The Army did. We had in the 101st about 680 helicopters all total. And then we had about another 50 to 100 brought up because as that operation went on, we were losing a lot of helicopters. Short version is it was supposed to be 4 months. They stopped it after 60 days because it was just a bloodbath. The Vietnamese got in there for about a week, and then the NVA came down and just started attacking all the bases and everywhere they were. Put that in perspective, there was about 20,000 South Vietnamese that ended up in Laos within about 2 weeks of starting, and the NVA, the North Vietnamese, put in over 60,000 troops, brought down all their heavy equipment, tanks. So every fire base we helped them set up and fly them into was attacked within either, as they rolled out, even going in to set them up, they would attack them. But if they'd been set up for a week or so, they would eventually come and attack them. And since they had to rely on us, we had to supply them. So and when the operation ended after 60 days, we had lost 116 helicopters shot down in Laos. We had another 600 plus battle damaged, and about 20% of those were so badly damaged they couldn't be used. We lost 78 helicopter crew members, we had 58 wounded, and we had 17 MIAs, and all this was within 60 days. We had a saying with the pilots, when we crossed the border between Laos and South Vietnam, you had a 50-50 chance of coming back alive. It was that rough. And to put it in another perspective, if you flew in South Vietnam and you went into what we called hot landing zones, you'd be shot at by small arms fire, AK-47s, machine guns. Some mortar rounds might plop in on the LZ, fragments of flying everywhere, and some rocket-propelled grenades. But within the second week when we were flying into Laos, we were shot at by 20-millimeter cannon, 40-millimeter cannon. It was like flying over Europe with the powder puffs, the bombers up there, and you see all that black. We weren't at altitude, but they could set those things where they could explode real close after they shot them off. So we took a lot of fire from those heavy weapons and tanks, and it was really rough. So flew through that. I was very fortunate. Went down a few times, but got out. When that ended, I finished my tour there with the 101st, flying other missions, but nothing like that. That came at the end of the war for the Americans. We wound down. Think about that now. It's 1971. Nixon's pulled out 2/3 of the troops. The war is where the rest of us are going to go home. And here they go and they kick off this operation deep in Laos, and they send the American helicopter force in to support them in 60 days. And you just sit there, I don't want to die over here now. I don't want to be the last man. So that was tough. That was tough to get up in the morning. It was tough to go to bed at night if you knew you were going to fly the next day. And everybody says, well, how would you describe it? I said, well, those 60 days were, if I'd been a cat, I used my 9 lives and then some. So, and the rest of my tour was much more, not as intense. I had a few moments between April and when I came back home in the middle of December, but that was more related to weather and mechanical issues. Seldom was there heavy fighting like we did then. So that was kind of my war experience in Vietnam.
Gotcha. Appreciate it. And just want to, so the helicopter that you flew, the Chinook, this is a troop carrier, right?
Yes. The Chinook is the big one. They still use them extensively in the Army. You carry internal loads, which would be troops, or externals, sling loads. In a combat situation, and all of them were combat in Laos, we didn't take any internal troops, because if we got shot down, that could be 5 guys in the Chinook, 30 guys in the troops inside. We carried all the sling loads. The Hueys, the slicks they call them, they would take in the troops, 6, 7 in a chopper, and they come in 15, 18 choppers. They drop them off and bring the men in and out. We'd bring in their supplies. We'd sling in their building supplies, their ammunition, their food, their water blivets, their 105s, their small Jeeps, and we'd have 2-3 slings hanging under the Chinook, and we'd come in and get into the LZ, drop them off, and take on off again. So we resupplied them. Without us, they wouldn't have got the supplies they needed. The Hueys could get them small stuff in, but it was basically get the men in and get them out and medevac them. We weren't allowed to take troops into Laos because of the potential for loss.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks so much for talking about this. Chariots of the Sky, a story about U.S. assault helicopter pilots at war in Vietnam, is your book. And who's your target audience, and why'd you write Chariots?
Well, I wrote it. I started out as a screenplay many, many years ago. Didn't get optioned, and 20 years later or so, I just decided, it's a story I wanted to tell because there's never been a movie made, number one, about the helicopter aspect of that war. You always hear a helicopter somewhere in a Vietnam War movie, but you don't really live through the chopper pilots, so to speak. So, and then there's not that many books out there about the helicopter aspect of the war, although there are several, and there's some really good ones. Most of them are written in the form of autobiography or biography or compilation of stories from different pilots and groups. So I just felt compelled to tell that story as best I could and get it out there about Lam Son. There's a couple books about Lam Son, but not too many. So I just chose to do that and see what happens. Again, it's been quite successful. I'm very pleased about that.
That's awesome. Love it. I got to ask, are you or some of the soldiers you fought with represented in your book, Chariots of the Sky?
I get a lot of that. People who know me said, you should have just called this an autobiography, Larry. I recognize some of it, but the answer to that is no, they're not. There's not one person. The characters are all fictional, but they are based on men that I served with to some extent. Like the main character, he's a little bit of me in there, but he's also a combination of 2 other fellows that were I was close to, and then there's a couple of commanding officers were loosely based on some men I served with and some of the other pilots. So they're all fictional, but there is some I drew on to build these people. I drew on people I had served with or knew a little bit. And the experiences that are in that book all actually happened to somebody in some group. I either saw it myself, experienced it, or knew about it. In that book, I wanted to put a helicopter pilots in the middle of what a helicopter pilot in Vietnam would endure. And I wanted the reader to basically experience all of it to some extent without going overboard. There's four basic ways a helicopter can ruin a pilot's whole day in combat. One is flying in combat. Two is having mechanical issues, which can happen, especially in Vietnam. They flew those helicopters to the maximum constantly. I mean, we literally would use duct tape to wrap around blades that had bullets that went through them until we get a new blade. Wow. Particularly some of the Hueys. Third would be weather. Vietnam was notorious for its weather. I personally had several incidents associated with weather. I had my share of mechanical issues too. And then lastly was human error. So a crew could experience any one of those, some of them more than one at the same time. And I wanted to capture all that. It wasn't just flying in and out of hot LZ. So there was a lot of I wanted to put in there and let the reader, experience.
Oh, excellent. I appreciate that. Your most recent book is Legacy of Honor, The Patriarch. This novel focuses on the horrors of World War I. Could you share some of what that war was like?
Well, like I said, I knew my grandfather, and I knew some of his friends, and I'll come back and cover that in a second. But I've big movie guy. I'd seen some movies over the years. There's not that many about World War I. Probably the newest one is that movie 1917 that got critically acclaimed.
Right.
But I've read books about it, and I've seen a lot of documentaries. Then, having experienced a little bit of combat myself, I had some of those emotions buried down that I could pull out when I was writing the book. But what it was like in World War I, that all wars are they're bad. They people die, people get wounded, people carry their experiences the rest of them. That just, no matter what war, what period of time, that's just the way it is. But in World War I, we transitioned from massive amounts of men fighting in long lines and just going at each other until one prevailed over the other. In World War I, they mechanized that to a degree that had never been experienced before. The machine guns were a major weapon used by both sides that could just cut down whole companies of men at a time, 200, 300 men at a time. Airplanes were introduced that could strafe and bomb from the air in World War I, the biplanes, which they did. Gas was used by all combatants during that war. They dropped artillery shells of gas, and then they even had rockets that would explode over the battlefield and drop pellets of gas down. And then the artillery was taken to a whole new level. They had huge artillery pieces and large mortars that could just drop incredible projectiles down on the battlefield, in the trenches, behind the trenches. So there was just a multitude of new weapons, and the tanks were introduced on the battlefield. So it was a highly mechanized war, which resulted in massive casualties and deaths. The war itself ran from 1914 to armistice in 1918, November 11th. And the Americans didn't get into it really until July of 1917. But prior to that, the French, the Belgians, the English, and the Germans, they went at each other. Millions of men were killed just before we got into that war. And then we lost several 100,000 of our men in the battle. When we went into the war in 1917 in June, July, we had an army of less than 200,000 men. When we came out of that war, we had over 4,000 men who had served in the army. In the last major battle, which I portrayed in the book, Moose-Argonne, we had two full armies, American armies involved with over 1 million men. fighting in that. We had a 25-mile section of the front line there, with the French on one side, the Belgium, and the English. And we had our own sector, 25 miles, and 1 million plus Americans fought in that sector to push the Germans through the valley and on the other side and try to get into Germany. And just in that conflict, we lost the most number of Americans. In my book, on the back of the book cover, there's a picture of the Moose Argonne Cemetery, where over 14,000 American soldiers are buried there that lost their lives just in that battle, which ran about 60 days. But it was horrendous. And they lined them up. They still fought the way they had prior to that, where you see the Civil War movies where all the troops are in big long lines, 2-3 deep, or the Revolutionary Wars, and just go out across these battlefields and shoot at each other. Well, that's how they did it there. They would just line up and go across these killing fields called no man's land and try and take each other's trenches, and just send waves and waves of men across them, subject them to all that metal coming, steel coming back at them. So it was a terrific, horrendous experience.
I appreciate you sharing that. It's just one of the problems of advancements is that when you go to war, they all play a role, don't they?
Oh, they do. Yeah. Look at what we got today.
Oh my gosh, yes. All right. So let's take the audience on a brief journey of your novel, Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch. Where are we in the war, and what's going on there?
Well, in the book, the story centers around the main character, protagonist Sam McCormick. He's a young man. He loses his mother and father in 1915 when the Lusitania is sunk by the Germans. They're going back to the old country where they had immigrated from to see their families, and their Lusitania is sunk by the German U-boat, and they lose their lives. And he's left by himself. He's like 16 at the time, 17, and he worked for his dad as a common laborer in Wellsville, Ohio, there as in a pottery factory, which his father was one of the owners of. Well, when the war breaks out, before the war breaks out, to make a little extra money, the character, like a lot of guys did back then, volunteers for the National Guard to make a little extra money so he could live a little more comfortably. And he did that, and then the war breaks out. And for the Americans, we declared war on the Germans in I think it was April or May of 1917, and they wanted to send an American division over to France as soon as possible. The military didn't think they had an regular army division ready. It was their guard units were more prepared than their regular army. So they were going to send a National Guard division over. But the problem was there was big war fever in our country at that time. And a lot of the states wanted their division to be the one to go over. There were like 20-some different National Guard divisions around the country. And they were afraid if they sent just one, the other states would be mad that theirs didn't go. So they came up with this idea of pulling units from all the Guard units and making one division out of different units from all the divisions, the National Guard division across the country. And at the time, Major MacArthur came up with the idea of calling it the Rainbow Division, which it became known as. The 42nd Division was the Rainbow Division because they pulled all these different units and send them over there. Our characters gets pulled into that. He's one of the units they draw from Ohio to form that unit. He goes over. He serves in the major battles that we were involved in leading up to the armistice. He gets wounded a couple times. He meets a French nurse in one of the recovery hospitals there, falls in love. And when the war ends, he comes back and he starts his life and marries this nurse, brings her back, and they settle in Louisville, Ohio. He goes back to work for steel companies and lives and works in that capacity. But he's dealing with a lot of health issues and not getting any help from anybody. These fellows had terrible digestive issues and respiratory issues, especially if they'd been gassed. And if they spent any time in the trenches, they would have been subjected to some gas. So he deals with all that, and then he gets pulled into the 1932 Bonus Army March, which is a pretty interesting part of our history that I really didn't know anything about till I researched it. Thought I got to put this in the book. I mean, it's I won't talk about it, but it's in the book. It's a pretty tragic event in our history, particularly the way we treated our veterans. Over 12,000 of them have descended on Washington to meet with Congress and demand they get their bonuses, which had been promised to them in 1919, but wouldn't be paid to them until 1945. Now think about that.
It's crazy.
A lot of these guys wouldn't be alive then. But anyway, they wanted their Congress to accelerate those and help them out in the Great Depression. And that was a tragic period of our history. And then these little steel strikes in the Ohio area in the 1937. Strikes across the country were, prevalent back in that time, and they could be pretty violent. And a lot of veterans worked in these different factories and stuff that were trying to unionize. So they always seemed to bear the brunt of what was taking place, and might have had something to do with, they'd served in the military and they had ingrained in them to help their fellow man and help each other. And they seemed to be targeted more or less than other people in those strikes. And so I wanted to capture a little bit of that. So that's my main character. He's got a pretty interesting life and sees a lot and experiences a lot. And he has a son, Sam, who will go on to, he's in book 2, and as a young boy, he's exposed to the aviation, which is really coming of its own, and he meets some pilots, and he wants to fly. And of course, in book 2, that's where we go with that.
That is awesome. And so that's a great segue, because that's what it's getting ready to say. Is so the Patriarch is part 1. So right. Could you give a commercial for part 2?
Yeah, part 2, it's called The Air Warrior. And Sam McCormick, the Patriarch, he has one son, Sean McCormick. And he goes on to be an aviator. In World War II, he's an Army Corps aviator, flying out of England with the 8th Air Force. He's involved in major bombing raids over Germany, survives the war, comes back, gets out, tries to get established in the civilian world for a while. And then the Korean War breaks out. He gets pulled back in, and he flew B-17s in Europe. And he's brought back in. He's transitioned to the B-29, sent over to Okinawa, and flies bombing missions over Korea, mostly North Korea, as the war progressed. And then the war ends. He comes back and he makes a career out of the military, and he's in what they call SAC, Strategic Air Command bomber bases. And he's pulled into the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early part of the Vietnam War. So his career spans World War II from the beginning to the early phases of the Vietnam War. But in writing that and researching some of that, I knew a little bit about World War II, having been around men that flew in that. And just something about World War II. Everybody's read books about that or seen some movies. Not so much about Korea. I mean, they call it the Forgotten War. And I wanted my character to fly over bombing raids over North Korea. And I researched that. And I was amazed at what these men went through flying missions over Korea. So I've embedded that in the book, and I think people that hopefully they'll buy the book, read it, and enjoy it from the standpoint of historical aspects. But they'll learn some stuff about the Korean War that I don't think most people know anything about. Not like I'm a historical guy, and I didn't know a lot of this stuff. Not that it's something I'd want to know any day, but I was just amazed at it. I don't know how these guys did it. I just don't know how they did it. But anyway, that's embedded in the book. So, and that is now out in an advanced reader copy to some reviewers, and we hope to have it published and out and available sometime the end of August, going into September. And we'll be posting that out on all my social medias when it's ready to go.
Awesome. And it's just around the corner, so good stuff. So let's talk about this. As we're starting to wrap up, while you were focused on researching and writing your books, or from your life's journey during the war in Vietnam, is there a lesson that will stick with you forever?
Well, a quick couple. Having been in Vietnam and doing what I did, I always enjoyed life, but I tell you what, it gave me a new, fresh perspective on don't take any day for granted. Enjoy every day, and live to your fullest. As you go through life, live it with character, live it with integrity. We're kind of like books, we're come back to book analogies, but we're born, which is chapter 1, and we die, which is the last chapter. What you do between those two chapters with your life is your life. And you can write as many chapters as you want during your life. And are they going to, are you going to live a good life? And is it going to be one that you're proud of, and other people would say, I knew that person, and you brought some value to your life and not maybe other people's lives. So I kind of just walk away with all that. And that's kind of what I'm trying to capture a little bit in the trilogy. You know, these characters each have their own beginning and end, and what they do in between to find them.
That's excellent. Love that message. Larry, could you share your thoughts about why we need to acknowledge the honor, courage, and sacrifice of soldiers of all wars?
Yes, having grown up around them my whole life, I actually met Audie Murphy when I was a little boy. Everybody knows or did know who Audie Murphy, the highest.
Oh, I do.
Decorated,
excellent.
Yeah, World War II soldier.
That's awesome.
Anyway, these are men and women that, they sign up, they take an oath, and then they go into the military. And I'm going to pull in our law enforcement people across the board, too, because it's the same scenario, in my opinion. And they put their lives on the line, whether they realize it or not, the day they take that oath. And in the military, there's no guarantee that you won't go into a war or a conflict or see some action. And if you do, there's no guarantee you're going to come out alive. So it's serious business. And we as Americans live in a country that enjoys a high degree, compared to a lot of places around the world, a high degree of freedom, low risk, opportunity, safety. We get up in the morning, we eat breakfast, drink our coffee, go to work, or do what we're going to do, and go throughout the day. And we really don't think about all this. We just take it for granted. And who are the people providing that for us? Because the world is full of bad people that want to take it away from us. And all you got to do is just look at the news, or read some of the stories out there, and just look at our recent history. So who is keeping them at bay? Who's giving us this sense of freedom? That's the people serving, the men and women in the military and the men and women in our law enforcement across the country. These folks deserve our respect. They deserve our support. And God bless them, because not everybody's cut out to do that kind of work. And the military is not for everybody. Now, just think about real quick, World War II, over 16 million men served in World War II. That was a large percentage of the men that were eligible to serve. Now we're lucky we can't even get 1%.
Right.
And the military is struggling to reach their recruitment goals by substantial amounts of numbers. So it's a whole different ball game. But who are these people? Where do they come from? Let's give them their respect and their support. And maybe the young people out there ought to look at possibly going into one of those areas. And it is a rewarding career. It is a rewarding endeavor, and it's certainly important. So if you know a veteran, show them respect.
Love it. Thank you so much. And you're so right. So right. Larry, if someone wanted to follow up and connect with you and or learn more, where would you send them?
Well, I'd start with my website, larryfreeland.com. You go there and you'll see a little bit about my books. You'll see the different articles and interviews and things that have been done. You'll see write-ups about it. You get a little of my history and background and all that. And that's a good place to start. And if you're intrigued or want to buy one of the books, you can go to buy the book, and it brings up the book, the 4 sites. It's available on Amazon, available on Barnes & Noble, Indie, and BAM, Books A Million. And you can hit any one of those, and it brings you right to their site with my book, and you can go, you can order it from there. I encourage people, if they use bookstores, to support their local bookstores, and you can order my books through that. And it's in paperback and it's in ebook format, all platforms. I'm also on Facebook and I'm in LinkedIn, and those are on my website at the bottom of each page that you pull up. So kind of there they are.
Excellent. And I'll have that information in the show notes also, so it's easy for them to find. And you want to remind them one more time about when your next book's coming out?
My next book is Legacy of Honor, The Air Warrior, and it should be out the end of August going into September. I'll put stuff out on our social media and you could pre-order it, which always helps for Amazon. If you get a lot of pre-orders on day one, you go, oh, look at that. It's a number one for the first day. Actually, my Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch, it was the number one bestseller for a new book for 2 weeks when it came out.
Excellent.
It's hanging in a little higher now, but it's done well too. But anyway.
That is awesome. Larry, thank you so much for sharing your books, Chariots of the Sky, a story about U.S. assault helicopter pilots at war in Vietnam, and Legacy of Honor, the Patriarch. These are powerful books, and thank you so much for your service to our country, and wishing you the best in all that you do.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you having me on. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching Learning Leading K12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching Learning Leading K12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.